Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Frequency of Love. This is Adeline Jones, and my guest today is Matt Kapinus. And I've invited Matt here today just because, frankly, he just has the most beautiful way of describing what I would call an integrated human being, a human being who's integrated with her or his sort of spiritual side, which I think is the journey that perhaps we're all on, a journey towards awakening. So thank you so much, Matt, for coming in. It's really fun to have you here.
Thanks for having me, Adeline.
Let's start with your yoga experience, really. I know there are a lot of people quite interested in that. And if you would define yoga, how would you do that?
Wow. Yeah. It's a big question. I'm sure there are whole books written about the mere definition of what yoga is. To break it down literally, yoga comes from the same root word meaning to yoke. And it's said that yoga creates a kind of yoking with the divine, although I'm not sure you could even say that it creates a yoking with the divine as much as I would say that it just confirms it. So somebody asked me, I had a cousin in town recently, and he had heard that. He had heard something about yoga being related to this word yoke. And he said, does yoga connect one to the divine? And I said to him, well, recognize that your connection to the divine is always there, that you're never separate from it. Yoga will create a kind of awareness of where your body may have sort of forgotten that, where your body might be in defense or guarded, or it might even show you where your mind has kind of created a wall of separation between you and what we might call the great oneness or God or God consciousness. So yoga is a kind of body of technology, I guess you could say. I wouldn't call it a religion because its practitioners come from all walks of faith. Yoga definitely has its roots in a more Hindu tradition, but as it's been brought over to America, Americans have kind of made it their own and found sort of core elements of truth without necessarily having to fall into that context of the Hindu pantheon of gods and goddesses and things like that. In the West here, I don't know, some might argue to the detriment of the institution of yoga. I definitely think it's made it a little bit more democratized, but we've been able to kind of pull yoga out of some of that. I think there's a lot of people who will, get into yoga and then they'll start getting into these other components like kirtan and chanting and wearing malas and things that are traditionally associated with that more Hindu path. But that being said, yoga is an 8-limbed path. And I don't know that I would want to dissect all the components of it, but a lot of what we think of as yoga, these exotic poses and contortions and the downward facing dogs and all, that's just one little sliver of a kind of practice of mindfulness whereby we start to minutely look at first our actions towards the world around us, and then we begin to look at our actions and our way of relating with ourself. And then we move on to these asanas, these poses and physical practice of yoga. And then there's some breath work, and it kind of concludes with a sort of meditative practice. Without kind of breaking down all the terminology of these sort of stages of meditation, eventually the idea is one is led to a samadhi state. I like to think of it as a samadhi moment because most human beings, even the most experienced yoga practitioners, will not walk around in a samadhi state. Samadhi makes it very difficult to drive, very difficult to kind of fulfill obligations because there's just a sense of the universe expressing itself through one in a kind of contemplative state. So samadhi is said to be literally the moment where the observer and the observed become one. And you can think about, say I were having a meditation on a flower. Eventually, it's no longer me looking at a flower, but to a certain degree, I become the flower becomes me. And what is the unifying element in that? I guess you could say awareness, consciousness. That's a great thing for one to meditate on. What is the quality of singularity or oneness? What would be the one component in the universe that you could say is the full expression of oneness? At some point, words are going to fail you here. But yoga's, to a certain degree, creating an opening whereby an individual can start to experience, maybe first in just small doses, these samadhi moments, but then over time they become more sustained, and one begins to engage in life with a deep recognition that one is not separate from the people around them, or that one is not in isolation. And when you start to have a more consistent baseline of being in that state of awareness, I wouldn't necessarily say that life gets easier, but life becomes a little bit more manageable. We find ourselves less prone to what we might call suffering moments. Doesn't necessarily mean that we will eliminate them altogether, but we start to move towards a more grounded, embodied way of being in the world that's less about defending ourselves or defending our beliefs or being right, less about being beholden to that endless cycle of attraction and aversion, whereby we push away experiences that are unpleasant, or that we move or cling to. We cling to experiences that we find pleasurable. We can exist in a kind of organic way that's more spontaneous, less motivated by conditioning, and hopefully more wise. There's a certain level of wisdom that one begins to express when you get this taste of the self as being an extension of the all, or God consciousness, or the oneness of the universe.
Do you think, though, what is the approach that someone should have when they're coming in to practice yoga? Because these results that you're talking about, are those a given, or does someone have to sort of be aware of what they might be wanting to?
One might have a kind of spontaneous awakening moment. History is replete with people who, not even necessarily coming from a specific teaching or tradition, have had awakening moments. And some of these people have been a little unsure about what to do with this and how to talk about it. In the yoga discourse, you get a little bit of confirmation sometimes from your teacher, or just kind of talking about yoga in the locker room, maybe what you've experienced on your yoga mat. I think it's an important thing that we do yoga in community, that we don't just rely on a home practice, because the awakening process has to happen in community. If you go off in a cave and you meditate and you can do back bends until you can touch your head to your heels behind you, it doesn't necessarily mean that you've integrated it to where you can kind of walk with both feet in the world. So a person first coming onto their yoga mat might have any number of reasons of why they're there. Probably at the bottom of that list is to awaken or achieve enlightenment. In fact, I would dare say, let that go as an agenda and consider, at least entertain, the notion that you might already be enlightened, and that really yoga will show you where you've forgotten that, where you've dropped out of presence and kind of gotten stuck in your own story or your beliefs about your body, your beliefs about your own limitations, yoga will start to reveal kind of the emptiness underneath those stories or beliefs that one has. It takes some time to maybe arrive there. But usually when people come onto their yoga mats, they're looking for things like pain relief, less stress, greater flexibility, maybe greater performance in their other athletic endeavors. And a kind of byproduct of that is people start to notice a very subtle shift beginning to happen, that they are more attentive to how they're sitting or how emotions are affecting them. They may be more attentive to foods that they're eating or how some input from the world around them has created an experience inside that one might see as suffering initially, but with that sense of presence, we start to cultivate a kind of spaciousness around our subjective experiences where we're more curious about it. We're not as quick to just kind of retreat when things get hard. We're able to sit a little bit more in the fire of our own experiences, sometimes that are very unpleasant, without necessarily wincing in a way that we might have in the past. I think Richard Freeman in Boulder here says that yoga really is kind of practicing the art of suffering, whereby one will go into a pose or hold a position for a while to where it gets to be a little unpleasant, and by coming back to the breath and coming back to that kind of witness consciousness that just says, I'm going to watch what's going on rather than trying to manipulate or force transformation or to break through this. I'm just going to kind of sit here and observe how my mind may wander, how my body may start to heat up in areas where I may start to get tired, and let some of that unpleasantness kind of cook me from within. And I guess that's sort of the insidious nature of yoga. You start doing all this work, these sometimes intense workouts, for lack of a better phrase, and you recognize that your fortitude to handle unpleasant experiences is very often much greater than you initially believed it to be.
Well, how does it work? I mean, how is it creating these effects on our bodies and minds?
Okay. So I guess there's a number of things that one could say about this. When we are kind of brought into this world as little babies, usually, unless you had a really awesome birth, maybe a water birth, and you were kind of put in warm water, as soon as you're brought out of the womb, you're kind of ripped into this world that's very bright, maybe a lot of loud noises. It may seem at the time, may seem even a little bit cold and armoring. And when we come out of the womb, there's a sense of not really wanting to be here fully. And as life kind of goes on, we sort of develop strategies for handling the unpleasant situations of life. And most of these strategies, while very conducive to staying alive, staying connected with larger community, aren't always the most life-affirming. So we may do things like entrain to the way our parents hold their bodies. And if our parents tend to kind of hunch over, there's a good chance that we as children will express a little bit of that. The way our parents may express anger, we may start to model that, even though we're not necessarily aware that we're doing it as a kind of imitation. It's kind of the primitive brain that learns to survive by schooling with the larger culture. So yoga gives us a moment to kind of reset the button. And or hit the reset button and pull back from some of these unconscious patterns of conditioning. How does it do that? Well, yoga or asana yoga, I'll just speak to that. Asana yoga takes the body through a series of poses. Usually you warm up, build a little heat, get some movement going, and then you start working into some of the bigger stretches. Now, when we come into a specific pose, the task at hand is not to look into the mirrors and see, am I doing this right? Are my arms in the right position or what have you? Eventually, we start to be driven by a more subtle curiosity, and we're asking ourselves questions like, where does energy feel stuck in my body? Are there any parts of my body that I can't really access with my breath? Are there any parts of my body that seem to be particularly tense when there's nothing to be tense around? And simply becoming aware of these places where energy may be blocked or locked off, we introduce awareness to parts of our being that might have previously kind of sat in the darkness. So the asana practice largely works by bringing the light of consciousness into this physical form and noticing these little places that maybe have been walled off or judged as bad or inferior or denied. And rather than kind of subscribing to those old stories that say this needs to be fixed or this needs to be changed, we find ourselves a little bit more able to kind of sit in things as they are. And that is sort of the strategy that we begin to take out into life with us. And it doesn't necessarily mean that we're the doormat to the world, but we begin to engage in life with first the recognition that there are certain things that are simply what they are. And Anthony DeMello, he called enlightenment, I love this line, he says, enlightenment is total cooperation with the inevitable, meaning that I think the operative word there is cooperation, that you're not just passively sitting back and letting life happen to you, but you're kind of working with it. You're cooperating with things as they are. And even though you may be in a scenario or a pose that's what we might call less than pleasant or kind of counterintuitive, that one would just kind of go into an intense pose that perhaps at times may make one want to cry or kind of challenges one's threshold to how long one can endure unpleasant experiences, we sort of retrain the brain to find a new kind of spaciousness to navigate life and all its complexities and ups and downs without kind of, as I said earlier, following that pattern of attraction and aversion.